A pleasure to meet all at last. And so, we are at it with our first piece relating to first impressions for 2026. And so, in terms of choices that I have been able to at least figure out, there were a good handful that I could situate for the year, but for the most part, January's pick is known as Legend of Heroes: Trails Beyond the Horizon. Yeah, a bit of a long name when you think about it, but this certainly wasn't the last game that we had around here, and it also wasn't the first. Because The Legend of Heroes has been a bit of a long-running anime series of video games, as well as some other media for some time. This, of course, just happens to be the latest installment in this franchise. But the thing is that much like many other long-running anime like Persona and Final Fantasy, I'd say The Legend of Heroes is one of those that's somewhat is like a mixed bag in some ways. But this is mostly just coming from the fact that I've only had about a few hours worth of playtime. Also, even though this came out all the way back on the 15th of January, it's now been well over a week, close to 2 weeks, since I've, of course, played this. And not only did it take a little while for me to arrive, but it also took me some time to get the footage rendered, as well as the research I needed in order to get my full understanding of the game itself, because a lot of the details are fresh in my mind. But here's the thing. As soon as the game starts, we do have the few cutscenes, one of which revolves around some sort of space station with a rocket. And before we know it, we do encounter some of our main cast. The main cast, of course, is a group of 3 people, with a young man known by the name of Van leading the 3. Of course, there is also 2 other personnel involved, but we are given our basics in terms of combat, as this is, of course, RPG related. But let me point something out real quick. In Trails Beyond the Horizon, we do have ourselves the opportunity to play in a turn setting. This was old tradition, especially with the older Final Fantasy games, in which that the players would have the turn, that the enemies would have a turn. The same sort of formula would happen in other RPG games, Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, and many other games like this. You know, it was common to have this sort of feature in these types of RPG games, especially in the olden days with Nintendo and Sega. But nowadays, knowing the fact that there is 3D capabilities as well as animation and the usage of freeform combat, one would think that that would be default here. Even the newer Final Fantasy games does allow for you to have freedom of movement allowed, as well as an unlimited amount of hits and healing and whatnot. You know, that's just typically how combat happens on a more realistic scale. It does happen in this game though, because when you first encounter enemies, there is a little thing that's around called shards. Now, shards happen to be kind of essential to the plot and storyline, at least from what I currently understand, in the time that I have played through the game so far. We do have ourselves a massive training course, and I kid you not by saying it takes around 90 minutes to beat. But that's not only because of the fact that we have the basic controls, such as the attack, defense, magic, healing, as well as the opportunity to switch between different characters. But we do have ourselves various forms of attack that can be done through specific button combinations, specials, as well as ultimates. And again, because this is a newer RPG game, they have to bring on a lot of big guns, because knowing that there's going to be a ton of enemies that are going to be incredibly hard to beat, I can say that they did a pretty good job at least giving us that sort of insight for what they could possibly throw at us in the future. But one other big thing out there that not very many people out there seem to like are how long and drawn out the cutscenes and dialogue boxes can be. The interaction between the characters is all right, and we do get a good understanding of what their personality is like, but again, a lot of this just seems a bit unnecessary. Very long, very drawn out, and fad in a way. It's sort of like how Peter Jackson's King Kong turned out to be, with over 3 hours of film time, along with many more minutes worth of bonus footage, deleted scenes, and even that famous recreation of an old scene from the original King Kong in which the characters fall into a pit full of giant bugs. that was cut and destroyed in the original, with only an image being the only evidence of its former existence. But Peter Jackson actually went on ahead and recreated that lost scene with the same exact style that was used back in the days of King Kong 1933. Anyways, though, the training course takes a while to beat through, and there are actually multiple teams that go through because, like I said, this is meant to be a training course, not just for one group of characters, but a few groups of characters. In fact, there are 3 groups of characters that show up just as well. I mean, you have yourself Van's group, and then there's another group with Kevin in it. Yeah, not very many memorable names there, but the point is that all these groups of characters, after we switch between and back and forth until they all reach the end, and eventually they're come by various directors and other higher characters in a way, that of which eventually organize a brawl between 2 teams. Essentially, there's the blue and red team, and the objective by this point in the game, after you get all the training stuff figured out, is to use your own wits as well as the many things you learned to fight against the other team of characters. Which actually is pretty clever. I mean, has Final Fantasy ever done that? Had all the characters come around eventually to battle each other like this? I mean, think about it. This is like creating all kinds of medicines to make you super powerful, and then all of a sudden you're forced to fight yourself. I mean, it's a cliche I haven't really even known in Final Fantasy all that well, because most of the time the characters just don't even bother fighting each other. I guess it happened at some point, I just don't realize it. I've only played like 15 of the games, and I know there's many more than that, not counting remakes and other things. But as for Trails Beyond the Horizon though, this long training course eventually leads up to a massive party filled with 1 million desserts. A well-catered room in which that is supposedly linked to a certain event that is unfolding. In fact, when the opening cutscene did show us that space station as well as a rocket, we do eventually get the rocket launching. And the event that transpires within the room with all the catered services and all that unique food, this is also where we get to come across a few things relating to chances. Basically, the choice perspectives in games that sort of reminds me of what Quantic Dream and Telltale used to do. Except in this instance, we do get choices that at least don't make a lot of effects within the game. I, of course, did allow for one character to try out a slice of a very unique cake. But this was not necessarily anything that made a ton of effect within the game itself, as the cake itself was thankfully easy to replace. But nonetheless, I can only imagine that later on in the game, some of the choices that we're gonna be making may have more dire consequences in the future. Like, they'll affect other characters, they'll affect the story, and like many other games with this sort of gameplay style, these kind of features can be pretty unnerving to some of us. I mean, I've even played through The Quarry, and a number of choices I made were pretty horrible. Yeah, and I guess you could say I'm not exactly the best in terms of these sort of games where the choices we make are what cause a lot of different problems. Or they might actually benefit the characters in a number of ways. But this is basically where we cut things off, because again, I've only gotten to around this point in the game. Going through the training course, going through the battles with each other, going through the room associated with socializing and a ton of desserts, and then of course, witnessing a rocket launch. So, I will say that so far in this game, 2 hours of time, and we had ourselves a lot of training, a lot of talk, a lot of desserts, which I'm sure could put anybody through a diabetic coma, and then of course, a rocket ship. So, things are getting vividly interesting, but as far as I know, I haven't gotten very much experience in the franchise of this series. So Legend of Heroes is something I might have to get into a little bit more in order to have a true understanding of what it's about. But for this exact leg that I can at least offer. Trails Beyond the Horizon at least does good with its gameplay, a variety of tools and weapons, different attack options, and it's always satisfying to take down a good variety of enemies and collect a bunch of treasures, like any other RPG we played so far. So, my final scoring for this at the moment is around 7.0 out of 10.1. Yeah, kind of on the average level here. But to be fair with you, I'm sure that later on in the game it'll get even better, or maybe it'll continue doing on with the same old cliche nonsense that we've been seeing so far. I can't really say that it's in any ways better than most other RPGs, but it actually is still putting up a valiant effort. And I can only hope that later on, if I play for another, let's say, 15 hours or how long this is supposed to go, I'm sure it'll be better in some ways. Maybe a turn of events will happen. Maybe new characters will show up with some newer abilities. We know that Final Fantasy has had its share of changes over the years in storyline, character lineups, voice acting, and many other unique beneficiaries. But I also have plenty of plans for the entirety of 2026. Even though I took a bit of a break throughout most of 2025, I probably won't need to do that this year. Also, one game a month. That's pretty much what I'm going with here. So, for the next installment, there's probably going to be a good chance that I'll have better games to talk about for February. But until then, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.